Grace Sinclair stepped down from the westbound stage into the dust of Cedar Ridge and knew she had made a terrible mistake. The town looked smaller than she remembered, meaner, the kind of place that never forgot and never forgave. She lifted her chin anyway, gripped her worn leather satchel, and walked toward the bank where her new position as bookkeeper waited. 6 years away had not been enough to erase the scandal, but it would have to be enough to survive it. The morning sun beat down hard on the main street, turning the dust to gold and the shadows to knife edges. Grace kept her eyes forward, ignoring the stares from the mercantile porch and the sudden silence that followed her like a curse. Her cream blouse stuck to her back under the faded shawl, and her skirt dragged through the dirt with each step. She had left Cedar Ridge as a girl accused of ruin. She had returned as a woman with nowhere else to go. The bank door stood open, but Grace never reached it. A man's voice cut across the street, sharp and certain, the kind of voice that expected to be obeyed. Deputy Eli Turner. Grace froze, her breath catching in her chest. She had not seen Eli in 6 years, not since the night everything fell apart. He had been the one who found her, the one who asked the questions, the one whose testimony had sealed her fate. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, and met his eyes across 20 feet of dirt and broken promises. He looked older, harder, weathered by years under the sun and the weight of a badge. His dark blonde hair hung a little too long under his hat, and his face carried the kind of tired handsomeness that came from too many sleepless nights. He wore a brown duster over a black vest, a gun belt sitting low on his hips, and the deputy star pinned where everyone could see it. His light stubble caught the sunlight as he stepped off the boardwalk and walked straight toward her. Grace's fingers tightened on her satchel. The street had gone quiet. Every eye in Cedar Ridge was watching. Eli stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his hand rested near his gun out of habit rather than threat. His voice, when he spoke, was low and rough, meant only for her, but loud enough that the silence carried it to every listening ear. You should not have come back. Grace lifted her chin, her pulse hammering in her throat. I have a job here, a legal position. You do not get to decide where I go. Eli's expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been regret or anger or both. He glanced past her at the bank, then back at her face, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone cold. You are wanted for questioning in the death of Samuel Garrett. The words hit like a physical blow. Grace took a step back, her breath gone, her vision narrowing to the man in front of her and the crowd pressing closer. Samuel Garrett, the name she had been running from for 6 years. The man whose death had destroyed her reputation, her family, her future. The man whose blood she had never spilled, but whose ghost had followed her across 3 territories. That is a lie, she said, and her voice shook despite her best effort. I was cleared. There was no evidence. Eli's face was stone. New evidence came to light. You need to come with me. Grace felt the world tilting. The crowd murmured, a low, dangerous sound like distant thunder. She saw faces she recognized, faces that had once smiled at her and now looked at her with suspicion and hunger for scandal. She saw the banker, Mr. Hollis, standing on the bank steps with his arms crossed and a small, cold smile on his lips. She saw the preacher's wife clutching her shawl and whispering to the woman beside her. And she saw Eli, The man who had once promised to believe her, now standing between her and any hope of a future. "I am not going anywhere with you," she said, and her voice came out stronger this time, edged with the fury that had kept her alive for 6 years. "If you have new evidence, show it. If you have charges, file them. But do not drag me through this street like a criminal in front of people who have already decided I am guilty." Eli's jaw tightened. "This is not a debate, Grace. You can walk with me to the sheriff's office, or I can arrest you right here. Your choice." Grace's hands trembled, but she did not look away. "Then arrest me. Let everyone see exactly what kind of man you have become." For a long moment, Eli just stared at her, and something in his expression cracked. Just a hairline fracture. But enough that Grace saw the man he used to be underneath the badge. Then he reached for her arm, his grip firm but not cruel, and the crowd surged forward with a collective gasp. "Wait." The voice came from the bank steps. Mr. Hollis descended slowly, his expensive suit immaculate despite the dust, his smile still in place. He was a tall man, thin and sharp, the kind of man who counted money while other people bled. He stopped beside Eli and Grace, his eyes on her face, assessing and cold. "Deputy Turner, perhaps we can resolve this more quietly. Miss Sinclair is my employee now. I would hate to see her first day disrupted by a misunderstanding." Eli's hand did not leave Grace's arm. "This is not a misunderstanding, Mr. Hollis. This is a murder investigation." Hollis tilted his head, his smile never wavering. "Of course. But surely, Miss Sinclair deserves the chance to settle in before being questioned. Perhaps tomorrow morning would be more appropriate. I will personally guarantee she remains available." Grace felt Eli's grip tighten for a fraction of a second, then release. She stepped back, her arm burning where his fingers had been, and watched the two men measure each other. Hollis was smooth, untouchable, a man who never got his hands dirty. Eli was the law, but even the law bent when money spoke. "Tomorrow morning," Eli said finally, his voice flat. 8 o'clock, sheriff's office. If she does not show, I will come for her." Hollis inclined his head. "You have my word, Deputy." Eli looked at Grace one more time, and the weight of everything unsaid hung between them like smoke. Then he turned and walked away, his duster swirling around his boots, his shoulders tight with anger or frustration, or something Grace could not name. The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, murmuring and casting glances over their shoulders. Grace stood frozen, her heart still racing, her mind spinning with questions she could not ask and answers she did not want to hear. Hollis touched her elbow, his grip light but insistent. "Come inside, Miss Sinclair. We have much to discuss." Grace followed him into the bank because she had no other choice. The interior was cool and dim, smelling of ink and old paper, and the faint metallic scent of coins. Hollis led her to a small office in the back, closed the door, and gestured to a chair. Grace sat, her knees weak, her hands folded in her lap to hide their shaking. Hollis settled behind his desk, steepled his fingers, and studied her with the same cold assessment he had shown outside. "You are wondering why I intervened." Grace said nothing. She did not trust her voice yet. Hollis leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. "Your family owns water rights to Red Mesa Creek. Small rights, admittedly, but valuable, especially now, with the railroad considering a route through this territory. I have made your father a generous offer. He has declined. Perhaps you can persuade him to reconsider." Grace's stomach turned. "You are using me." Hollis smiled. "I am offering you protection. The deputy will not forget tomorrow's appointment. If you are arrested, your family's position becomes even more precarious. But if you help me secure those water rights, I can ensure the new evidence against you disappears as quietly as it appeared." Grace's hands curled into fists. "What new evidence?" Hollis shrugged. "Does it matter? Evidence is simply a matter of perspective, Miss Sinclair. And perspective can be shaped by those with the resources to do so." Grace stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I will not sell my family's land to save myself from a lie." Hollis's smile faded. "Then I hope you enjoy your conversation with Deputy Turner tomorrow. He is a dedicated lawman. Once he decides someone is guilty, he does not let go." Grace left the bank with her satchel and her pride, and nothing else. The sun had climbed higher, turning the street into a furnace. She walked toward the edge of town, toward the small boarding house where she had arranged a room, and tried to think past the panic clawing at her chest. New evidence. Shaped perspective. A murder she did not commit, but could not escape. And Eli Turner, who had once looked at her with something other than accusation, now wearing a badge, and the certainty that she was guilty. Grace reached the boarding house, a narrow 2-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch. Mrs. Dalton, the owner, met her at the door with a tight smile and a coldness that had not been in her letters. Grace paid for a week in advance, took her key, and climbed the stairs to a room barely large enough for a bed and a washstand. She closed the door, dropped her satchel, and sat on the edge of the bed with her face in her hands. 6 years ago, Samuel Garrett had been found dead in the alley behind the saloon, a knife in his chest, and Grace's shawl on the ground beside him. She had been 17, foolish enough to meet a man alone, desperate enough to believe his promises. When he tried to force himself on her, she had fought. She had run. And when his body was found an hour later, every finger in town had pointed at her. The sheriff had questioned her for 2 days. Eli, barely 20 and newly deputized, had been the one to take her statement. She had told him the truth, every humiliating detail, and he had written it all down with a careful hand and eyes that promised he believed her. But when the sheriff declared there was not enough evidence to charge anyone, the town had made its own judgment. Grace's family had been shunned. Her father's business had failed. Her younger brother had been sent away to relatives in the East, and Grace had left on the first stage west, carrying nothing but shame and the knowledge that Eli Turner's belief had not been enough to save her. Now she was back, and the nightmare had followed her. Grace washed her face in the basin, changed into a clean blouse, and tried to decide what to do. She could run again, but she had nowhere left to go. She could stay and fight, but she had no weapons and no allies. She could beg her father to sell the water rights, but that would destroy the last piece of security her family had left. Or she could go to Eli Turner and demand the truth. Grace stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked back into the furnace of the afternoon. The sheriff's office sat at the far end of Main Street, a squat stone building with barred windows and a hitching post out front. Grace pushed through the door into the dim interior, where the air was cooler but no less oppressive. The sheriff, an older man with a gray beard and tired eyes, looked up from his desk and frowned. "Miss Sinclair, you are early. I want to speak to Deputy Turner." The sheriff glanced toward the back room, then back at Grace. He is not here. Out on patrol. Grace's jaw tightened. Then I will wait. The sheriff shrugged and returned to his paperwork. Grace sat on the hard wooden bench against the wall and folded her hands in her lap. She waited through the long afternoon, watching the light shift through the window, listening to the sounds of the street outside. She waited while the sheriff left for supper and returned with the smell of stew on his coat. She waited until the sun sank low and the shadows grew long, and the door finally opened. Eli stepped inside, his duster dusty and his face drawn with fatigue. He stopped when he saw Grace, his hand still on the door, his eyes narrowing. "You should not be here." Grace stood. "You accused me of murder in front of the entire town. I think I have earned the right to know why." Eli closed the door and crossed to the sheriff's desk without looking at her. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and tossed it onto the desk. The sheriff picked it up, read it, and let out a low whistle. "Where did you get this?" Eli's voice was flat, controlled. Anonymous tip. "Left at the office 3 days ago." Grace stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What does it say?" Eli finally looked at her, and the weight of his gaze was like a physical thing. "It says you were seen arguing with Samuel Garrett 2 hours before he died. It says you threatened him. It says you had a reason to want him dead." Grace's breath came short and fast. "Who saw me? Who made this claim?" Eli's jaw worked. "Anonymous." Grace laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Anonymous. Of course. You are going to ruin my life again, based on an anonymous letter." Eli's hands curled into fists at his sides. "I am doing my job, Grace. A man was murdered. You were the last person seen with him. You had motive. You had opportunity. And now, there is a witness." Grace took a step closer, close enough to see the gold flecks in his eyes, the stubble on his jaw, the way his shoulders were locked tight with tension. "You do not believe this. I know you do not." Eli's voice dropped, rough and low. "What I believe does not matter. The law matters." "Then the law is a coward." Eli flinched as if she had struck him. The sheriff cleared his throat and stood, moving toward the door. "I am going to check the back cells. You two keep it civil." The door closed behind him, leaving Grace and Eli alone in the lamplight. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Grace could hear Eli breathing, could see the way his hands opened and closed, could feel the years between them like a canyon too wide to cross. "I did not kill Samuel Garrett," she said, and her voice was steady now, cold and clear. "I did not threaten him. I fought him off, and I ran, and when I heard he was dead, I was relieved. But I did not kill him." Eli looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, just enough that Grace saw the fracture again, the doubt he was trying to bury. "Why did you come back?" Grace's throat tightened. "Because I have nowhere else to go. Because my family needs me. Because I am tired of running from something I did not do." Eli turned away, his hand braced on the desk, his shoulders rising and falling with a deep breath. 6 years ago, I believed you. I wrote in my report that you were credible, that the evidence did not support a charge, and the town crucified you anyway." Grace's chest ached. "I know." Eli looked back at her, and for the first time, she saw the weight he carried. The guilt, and the anger, and the helplessness. I cannot do that again, Grace. I cannot stand up for you and watch them tear you apart. Not if there is evidence. Grace stepped closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in the lines of his face. Then, find out who is lying. Find out who wants me to take the fall for a murder I did not commit. Do your job, Eli. Do not just follow orders. Eli's eyes searched hers, and for a moment, Grace thought he would agree. Then, his expression hardened again, the fracture sealing over. Come back tomorrow at 8. Bring anyone who can verify your whereabouts the night Garrett died. If you do not show, I will issue a warrant. Grace's hands shook with fury and frustration, and something dangerously close to heartbreak. Fine. I will be here, and when this is over, I hope you can live with what you have done. She turned and walked out into the cooling evening, leaving Eli standing in the lamplight with the anonymous letter and the weight of 6 years between them. Grace walked back to the boarding house under a sky turning deep purple at the edges. The street was quieter now, the shops closing, the lamplights flickering to life one by one. She passed the saloon, where laughter and piano music spilled into the street, and the church, dark and silent on its hill. She passed families heading home, and men heading toward whiskey, and women pulling curtains closed against the night. She reached the boarding house and climbed the stairs to her room, her body heavy with exhaustion, and her mind racing with plans she did not have. She lit the lamp on the washstand, sat on the edge of the bed, and tried to think. She needed proof. She needed someone who had seen her that night, someone who could swear she had been nowhere near the alley when Samuel Garrett died. But 6 years had scattered the witnesses, and the people who had been willing to speak for her then were not likely to step forward now. Grace pulled her satchel onto the bed and opened it, sorting through the few belongings she had brought. A change of clothes, a hairbrush, a small leather journal where she kept her accounts. And at the bottom, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, a folded piece of paper. She unwrapped it carefully, her fingers trembling. It was a letter, worn soft at the creases from being opened and refolded 100 times. The handwriting was careful, precise, the words brief. I believe you. I am sorry I could not do more. E. Grace had found it slipped under her door the night before she left Cedar Ridge. She had carried it across 3 territories, through a dozen towns, through years of loneliness and shame, and the slow, painful work of rebuilding herself. She had told herself it meant nothing, that Eli Turner was just another man who believed, but did not act. But she had kept it anyway. Now she folded it again and tucked it back into the cloth. Then she pulled out the journal and began to write. Names, dates, locations. Everything she could remember about the night Samuel Garrett died. Everything she had told Eli 6 years ago, and everything she had been too ashamed to say. She wrote until the lamp burned low and her hand cramped, and the night outside her window grew deep and silent. Then, she closed the journal, blew out the lamp, and lay down in her clothes on top of the blanket. Tomorrow she would face Eli Turner and the law and the town that wanted her guilty. But tonight, she would rest, and she would plan. Grace woke to the sound of shouting. She sat up, disoriented. the gray light of dawn filtering through the thin curtains. The shouting came from the street below, male voices raised in anger and alarm. Grace swung her legs off the bed, crossed to the window, and looked down. A crowd had gathered near the Mercantile, a tight knot of men and women pointing toward the loading dock at the back of the building. Grace could see Mr. Calhoun, the Mercantile owner, gesturing wildly, his face red with fury. She could see the sheriff pushing through the crowd, and behind him, Eli Turner, his duster swirling as he moved. Grace grabbed her shawl, shoved her feet into her boots, and ran downstairs. Mrs. Dalton stood on the porch with her arms crossed, watching the commotion with tight-lipped disapproval. What happened? Mrs. Dalton did not look at her. Sabotage. Someone destroyed the shipment that came in last night. Smashed crates, ruined goods. Mr. Calhoun is saying it is thousands of dollars lost. Grace's stomach sank. She hurried toward the crowd, pushing through until she could see the loading dock. The scene was chaos. Broken crates lay scattered across the platform, their contents spilling into the dirt. Bolts of fabric soaked in oil. Sacks of flour slashed open and trampled. Tools bent and broken. The smell of kerosene hung thick in the air. Eli stood on the platform, crouched beside one of the crates, examining the wood. The sheriff was questioning Mr. Calhoun, who gestured and shouted about ruin and insurance and revenge. Grace edged closer, trying to hear. Eli looked up, and his eyes found Grace in the crowd. For a moment, their gazes locked. Then he stood, wiped his hands on his duster, and called to the sheriff. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. The crates were pried open with a crowbar. The cuts are clean. This was not random. The sheriff nodded. Any idea who? Eli's jaw tightened. Not yet. But I will find out. Mr. Calhoun stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. I know who did it. It was that Sinclair girl. She shows up, and the next day my shipment is destroyed. That is not a coincidence. Grace's blood turned to ice. The crowd shifted, heads turning toward her, eyes narrowing. She felt the weight of their suspicion like a noose tightening. That is absurd, she said, her voice loud enough to carry. I have no reason to sabotage your shipment. I do not even know you. Calhoun pointed at her, his finger shaking. Your family has been fighting with Mr. Hollis over those water rights. Everyone knows Hollis backs my store. You are trying to hurt him by hurting me. Grace's mind raced. She had no connection to the Mercantile, no reason to destroy goods, no knowledge of Hollis's business dealings beyond what he had told her yesterday. But the logic did not matter. The town wanted someone to blame, and she was already guilty in their eyes. Eli stepped down from the platform, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. He moved through the crowd toward Grace, and the people parted to let him pass. Grace stood her ground, her chin lifted, her hands fisted in her shawl. Eli stopped in front of her, his expression unreadable. Where were you last night? In my room. At the boarding house. Anyone see you? Grace's heart sank. Mrs. Dalton went to bed at 9. I was alone after that. Eli's eyes flicked past her toward the boarding house, then back to her face. Did you hear anything? See anyone? No. I was writing in my journal. I did not hear anything until the shouting this morning. Eli studied her for a long moment, and Grace could see the calculation behind his eyes, the weighing of evidence and suspicion and belief. Then, he nodded once, turned back to the crowd, and raised his voice. Miss Sinclair is accounted for. She has no connection to this crime. If anyone has information about who was near the Mercantile last night, come to the sheriff's office. The crowd muttered, dissatisfied, but unwilling to challenge the deputy directly. Calhoun's face went redder, his mouth opening to protest. But the sheriff put a hand on his shoulder and shook his head. Slowly, reluctantly, the crowd dispersed. Grace stood frozen, her heart pounding, her breath short. Eli had defended her. In front of the entire town, he had said she was innocent. She did not know what to do with that. Eli walked back to the platform, exchanged a few words with the sheriff, then turned and walked toward her. Grace braced herself, but he did not stop. He walked past her, close enough that his sleeve brushed her shawl, and kept going toward the sheriff's office. Grace followed. She did not know why, did not know what she would say, but her feet carried her down the street after him. Eli did not look back, did not slow, just kept walking with that long, ground-covering stride until he reached the office and pushed through the door. Grace caught the door before it closed and followed him inside. Eli stopped in the middle of the room, his back to her, his shoulders tight. You should not be here. Grace closed the door. You defended me. Eli turned, his face shadowed in the dim light. I stated a fact. You were not involved in the sabotage. How do you know? Eli's jaw worked. Because I know you. Because you would not risk everything to destroy a shipment that means nothing to you. Because whoever did this wanted it to look like you. Grace's breath caught. You think I am being framed? Eli crossed to the desk, picked up the anonymous letter, and held it up. This letter. The sabotage. Your arrival. It is all too convenient. Someone wants you back in Cedar Ridge so they can pin more crimes on you. Grace's mind spun. Why? Who would benefit from that? Eli set the letter down and looked at her with tired, shadowed eyes. That is what I need to find out. But until I do, you are in danger. If another crime happens and you cannot prove where you were, the town will not wait for a trial. Grace swallowed hard. What do I do? Eli hesitated, then pulled a chair out from the desk. Sit. Tell me everything you remember about the night Samuel Garrett died. Every detail, no matter how small. Grace sat, her hands folded in her lap, and began to talk. She told him about Samuel's promises, his pressure, the way he had cornered her behind the saloon. She told him about fighting him off, running to the church, hiding in the back pew, until she was sure he was gone. She told him about walking home through the alleys, her shawl clutched tight, her heart pounding with fear and shame. And she told him about the sound she had heard as she passed the alley where Samuel's body would be found. A sound like boots on gravel, fast and purposeful, moving away from her. Eli's pen stopped. You heard someone running? Yes. I thought it was just someone leaving the saloon. I did not think anything of it until later. Eli leaned back, his eyes distant. You never mentioned that in your first statement. Grace's throat tightened. I was 17 and terrified. I did not know it mattered. Eli tapped the pen against the desk, his mind clearly working through possibilities. If someone else was in that alley, if someone else killed Garrett, they would have known you were nearby. They could have dropped your shawl to frame you. Grace's pulse quickened. But who would want Samuel dead? Eli shook his head. Garrett was not well liked. He owed money. He had a temper. There were plenty of people with motive. But no one with proof. Then find proof. Grace leaned forward, her voice urgent. Someone in this town knows the truth. Someone saw something. You just have to find them before they destroy me. Eli met her eyes, and for the first time since she had returned, Grace saw the man he used to be. The man who had believed her. The man who had written her a letter and slipped it under her door because he could not save her. But he could at least let her know she was not alone. I will find them, he said quietly. I promise. Grace wanted to believe him. She wanted it so badly it hurt. But promises, she had learned, were easy to make and hard to keep. Eli walked Grace back to the boarding house under the climbing sun. They did not speak, but the silence between them felt different now. Less like a wall and more like a truce. When they reached the porch, Eli stopped and looked down at her. Stay close to people. Do not go anywhere alone. If anything happens, anything at all, you come find me. Grace nodded. What about tomorrow morning? The questioning. Eli's jaw tightened. I will still need your statement. But I am going to look into that anonymous letter first. If I can prove it is false, the charges will not hold. Grace searched his face. Why are you helping me? Eli looked away, his hand resting on his gun belt. Because I should have done more 6 years ago. Because I let the town decide you were guilty when I knew better. And because if someone is using the law to destroy you, then the law needs to make it right. Grace's throat ached. Thank you. Eli nodded once, then turned and walked away, his duster swirling behind him. Grace watched until he disappeared around the corner, then climbed the stairs to her room. She had 3 days of work waiting at the bank. 3 days to prove she could do the job, hold her head high, and survive the whispers and stares. 3 days to let Eli investigate while she kept her promise to stay visible and accountable. But when she pushed open her door, she stopped cold. Her room had been searched. The bed was torn apart, the mattress askew. Her satchel had been dumped on the floor, her clothes scattered. The washstand was overturned, the basin cracked on the floorboards. And on the wall above her bed, someone had written a single word in black paint, still dripping. Murderer. And Alder was supposed to key what space? Wistabite. The mentling the stress the winter widder and Notchmahir. Ceres' place where lost in the housed white. And then timered. Cone that dranding a tentiganiter. All the fimer, all the calming the plant or spoons the twice. Grace's hands shook as she backed out of the room. She stumbled down the stairs, her vision blurring, her breath coming in gasps. Mrs. Dalton stood in the front hall, arms crossed, face hard. I want you out. Tonight. I will not have this kind of trouble under my roof. Grace tried to speak, but no words came. She turned and ran, out the door, down the steps, into the street. She did not know where she was going, only that she had to move, had to get away from the word on the wall and the hatred it represented. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs trembled, and she found herself on the edge of town, near the old livery stable. She collapsed against the fence, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. She had been back in Cedar Ridge less than 2 days, And already, everything was falling apart. A horse nickered softly from inside the stable. Grace wiped her face, straightened, and looked up. Eli stood in the stable doorway, a saddle over one shoulder, his eyes widening when he saw her. Grace. She tried to speak, but her voice broke. Eli dropped the saddle and crossed to her in 3 long strides. He caught her shoulders, his hands firm and steady, his face close to hers. What happened? Grace shook her head, the words tumbling out. My room. Someone broke in. They destroyed everything. They painted on the wall. They called me a murderer. Mrs. Dalton wants me gone. I have nowhere to go. I cannot do this. I cannot. Eli's hands tightened on her shoulders. Look at me. Grace, look at me. She did. His eyes were fierce, determined, the hardness gone, and something raw in its place. You are not alone. Do you hear me? You are not alone. Grace's breath hitched. Where am I supposed to go? No one will take me in. No one will help me. Eli's jaw set. My place. You will stay at my place. Grace stared at him. I cannot. That will make everything worse. The town will say, I do not care what the town says. Eli's voice was rough, edged with anger. You need a safe place, and I am offering it. 1 room, separate quarters, nothing improper. But you will not sleep in the street, and you will not run again. Not while I can stop it. Grace's chest ached with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Why are you doing this? Because 6 years ago, I failed you. And I will not fail you again. Grace let Eli lead her to his cabin at the edge of town. It was small, rough. A single room divided by a curtain, with a stove and a table and a narrow bed. Eli pulled the curtain aside to show her the space behind it, just big enough for a cot and a washstand. It is not much, but it is safe. Grace nodded, too exhausted to argue. Eli brought her satchel from the boarding house, along with her scattered belongings stuffed into a pillowcase. He did not ask about the word on the wall. He did not need to. While Grace washed her face and tried to pull herself together, Eli made coffee on the stove. When she emerged from behind the curtain, he handed her a tin cup and gestured to the table. Drink. Then tell me everything you saw. Grace wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat ground her. She described the destroyed room, the overturned furniture, the paint still wet on the wall. Eli listened, his face grim, his jaw tight. When did you leave this morning? Just after dawn, when the shouting started. So someone broke in between dawn and when you came back. That is a narrow window. Eli stood, paced to the window, looked out at the street. Someone is watching you. Someone who knew you would be at the mercantile. Someone who wanted to send a message. Grace's hands tightened on the cup. Or someone who wanted to drive me out of town. Eli turned back to her. That too. They sat in silence for a long moment. The weight of the threats and the sabotage and the anonymous letter pressing down like a storm about to break. Then Eli spoke, his voice low and careful. Tell me about Mr. Hollis. Grace looked up. What about him? Eli leaned against the table, his arms crossed. He intervened yesterday. He offered you protection in exchange for your family's water rights. and he has the resources to manufacture evidence and destroy property. Grace's pulse quickened. You think he is behind this? Eli shook his head. I do not know. But I think he benefits from you being desperate. And I think he is not a man who takes no for an answer. Grace set the cup down, her mind racing. If Hollis is trying to force my family into selling, framing me for murder is a good way to do it. If I am arrested, my father will have no choice. Eli nodded slowly. That is what I am thinking. But I need proof. And I need to know who else is involved. Grace stood, her exhaustion replaced by a cold, clear fury. Then we find proof. We talk to people who knew Samuel Garrett. We find out who else was in that alley 6 years ago. And we stop Hollis before he destroys anyone else. Eli met her eyes, and something shifted between them. Something that felt like partnership, like trust, like the beginning of something neither of them had expected. All right. We start tomorrow. But tonight, you rest. You are safe here. I give you my word. I give you my word. Grace wanted to believe him. And for the first time in 6 years, she did. That night, Grace lay on the narrow cot behind the curtain and listened to Eli moving around the cabin. She heard him banking the fire, checking the door, settling onto his bed with the creak of old rope and wood. She heard his breathing slow, deep and steady. The sound of someone who had learned to sleep lightly and wake fast. She should have felt afraid. She should have felt exposed, vulnerable, trapped in a cabin with a man she barely knew anymore. But instead, she felt something close to safe. And that terrified her more than anything else. Grace woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and the sound of Eli moving quietly around the stove. She dressed quickly behind the curtain, braided her hair with shaking fingers, and emerged into the pale morning light. Eli glanced at her, then nodded toward the table. Eat. We have a long day. Grace sat and took the plate he handed her. The bacon was crisp, the biscuit warm, and for a moment she let herself pretend this was normal, that she was not hiding in a deputy's cabin while someone tried to destroy her life. Eli poured coffee and sat across from her, his face shadowed with stubble and the remnants of sleep. Today, we talked to people who knew Garrett. The saloon owner, the men he owed money to, anyone who might have wanted him dead. Grace swallowed a bite of biscuit. What about the anonymous letter? Eli pulled it from his coat pocket and unfolded it on the table. I have been looking at the handwriting. It is careful, deliberate, like someone trying to disguise their hand. But there are patterns. The way the T crosses, the slant of the S. I have seen handwriting like this before. Where? Eli's jaw tightened. Bank documents. Hollis's ledgers. Grace's breath caught. You think Hollis wrote the letter? I think someone in his employ did. Or someone working with him. Eli refolded the letter and tucked it away. But I need to compare it directly. Which means I need access to the bank's records. Grace's mind raced. I am the bookkeeper. I have access. Eli looked at her sharply. No. It is too dangerous. I am already in danger. Grace leaned forward, her voice urgent. And if we wait, Hollis will have time to cover his tracks. Let me do this. I can copy the handwriting samples you need. No one will suspect the bookkeeper reviewing ledgers. Eli stared at her for a long moment, conflict clear in his eyes. Then he nodded slowly. All right. But you do not confront him. You do not ask questions. You get what I need and you leave. Grace exhaled, her heart pounding. I can do that. Eli stood, grabbed his hat, and checked his gun. Then, let us move. They walked to the bank through the quiet morning streets, side by side, but not touching, keeping a careful distance that fooled no one. Townspeople watched from windows and porches, their faces hard with judgment. Grace kept her chin up and her eyes forward. Hollis was waiting for her in his office, his desk covered with ledgers and correspondence. He looked up when Grace entered, his cold smile in place. Miss Sinclair, I heard about the incident at the boarding house. Most unfortunate. Grace sat and pulled a ledger toward her. I am here to work, Mr. Hollis. Hollis leaned back, his fingers steepled. Of course. But first, have you considered my offer? Your father's water rights in exchange for my protection. Grace's hands trembled, but she kept her voice steady. I have considered it. And my answer is still no. Hollis's smile faded. That is a shame. I had hoped we could resolve this amicably. But if you insist on being difficult, I cannot guarantee your safety. The town is very angry about the sabotage, and you remain the most convenient suspect. Grace looked up, her eyes meeting his. I did not sabotage the mercantile. And you know it. Hollis tilted his head. What I know, and what I can prove, are two different things, Miss Sinclair. Just as what you believe, and what a jury will believe, are two different things. Grace's pulse hammered, but she forced herself to smile. Then I suppose we both have work to do. She bent over the ledger and began copying figures. Hollis watched her for a long moment, then stood and left the office. The moment he was gone, Grace pulled out sheets of correspondence and began copying the handwriting, her fingers flying across the page. She worked quickly, filling 2 pages with samples, then tucked them into her skirt pocket and returned to the ledgers. When Hollis came back an hour later, she had a column of figures ready for his review. Hollis glanced at her work, nodded, and dismissed her. Grace left the bank with the handwriting samples burning against her leg and her heart hammering in her chest. Eli was waiting near the livery. Grace crossed to him, pulled the folded pages from her pocket, and handed them over. Eli unfolded them, compared them to the anonymous letter, and went very still. It is a match. Grace's breath caught. You are sure? Eli nodded slowly. The T-crosses, the slant, the spacing. This is the same person who wrote the letter accusing you of threatening Garrett. Grace's mind spun. So Hollis, or someone working for him, wrote the letter. Which means they fabricated the evidence. Which means I was right. I am being framed. Eli folded the papers carefully and tucked them into his coat. We still need more. We need to know who killed Garrett and why. And we need to connect Hollis directly to the sabotage. How do we do that? Eli's jaw set. We find the person who was in the alley that night. The person you heard running. They spent the afternoon tracking down witnesses. Eli questioned the saloon owner, a grizzled man named Polk, who remembered Samuel Garrett as a mean drunk with a temper and debts he never paid. Polk also remembered seeing a man leave the saloon around the time Garrett died. Someone tall and wearing a dark coat. But he could not remember the face. Grace spoke quietly with women who had known her 6 years ago. Women who had once been kind before the scandal drove them away. Most refused to talk. But one, an older woman named Mrs. Fletcher, pulled Grace aside and spoke in a low, urgent voice. "I saw you that night, running from the alley. You looked terrified. And I saw someone else too, a few minutes later. A man in a dark coat, walking fast, carrying something. I did not think anything of it then. But later, when they said Garrett was dead, I wondered." Grace's pulse raced. "Did you see his face?" Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. It was dark, and I was afraid to look too close. Grace thanked her and found Eli at the sheriff's office. She told him what Mrs. Fletcher had said, and Eli added it to the notes he had been compiling. A picture was forming. Someone had killed Samuel Garrett. Someone who knew Grace had been there. Someone who had used her shawl to frame her. But who? And why? Eli leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. Garrett had enemies. Men he cheated, women he wronged. But none of them had a reason to frame you specifically. Unless what? Eli looked at her. Unless framing you was the point. Unless someone wanted you driven out of town so they could pressure your family. Grace's stomach turned. Hollis, or someone working for him. Eli stood, paced to the window. 6 years ago, your family owned clear water rights. Hollis was just starting to buy up land. If he wanted Red Mesa Creek, he needed your family desperate. What better way than to destroy your reputation and drive you away? Grace's hands curled into fists. So he killed Samuel Garrett. Or had him killed. And made it look like I did it. Eli turned back to her. That is the theory. But I need proof. I need someone who will testify that Hollis ordered the killing. Or I need physical evidence linking him to Garrett's death. Grace's mind raced. What about the knife? The one that killed Garrett. Was it ever found? Eli shook his head. It disappeared from evidence 6 years ago. The sheriff at the time said it was lost. But now I am wondering if it was taken. By Hollis. By someone who did not want it examined too closely. Grace took a breath, her resolve hardening. Then we find it. And we make Hollis answer for what he did. Eli met her eyes, and the connection between them felt solid now. Real. Built on something more than old promises and new desperation. All right. Tonight, we search his office. Grace's breath caught. That is illegal. Eli's smile was grim. So is framing an innocent woman for murder. They waited until full dark, until the streets emptied, and the lamps in the windows went out one by one. Eli led Grace through the alleys, moving silently, his hand on his gun. They reached the back of the bank, and Eli tested the door. Locked. He pulled a thin piece of metal from his coat pocket and worked the lock with practiced ease. The door swung open with a soft creak. Eli stepped inside, Grace close behind him. The bank was dark and silent, smelling of ink and old paper and the faint metallic tang of money. Eli lit a small lantern, keeping the flame low, and led Grace to Hollis's office. The door was locked too. Eli picked it, and they slipped inside. Grace went straight to the desk while Eli searched the filing cabinets. She rifled through papers, correspondence, ledgers, looking for anything that connected Hollis to Samuel Garrett or the night he died. She found nothing. Nothing obvious, nothing damning, just business records and dry legal documents. Grace's frustration mounted. Then she opened the bottom drawer and froze. Eli. He crossed to her side, holding the lantern high. Grace pulled out a small wooden box, ornately carved, clearly expensive. She opened it. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a knife. The blade was long, narrow, stained dark at the tip. The handle was wrapped in leather, worn smooth with use. Eli took the box carefully, his face grim. This could be it. The murder weapon. Why would he keep it? Eli shook his head. Arrogance. Or insurance. If someone else tried to blackmail him, he could produce it and turn the blame. Grace's hands shook. Can you prove it is the same knife? Not without a witness. But it is enough to bring him in for questioning. A sound in the outer office made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving toward the door. Eli blew out the lantern and pulled Grace behind the desk, his hand on his gun. The door opened. Mr. Hollis stood silhouetted in the doorway, a lamp in one hand and a revolver in the other. His cold smile was back, sharper now, edged with triumph. Deputy Turner. Miss Sinclair. Breaking into my office. How unfortunate. Eli stood slowly, his hand still on his gun. We found the knife, Hollis. The one that killed Samuel Garrett. The one you used to frame Grace. Hollis tilted his head. Did you? And how do you plan to prove that? You are trespassing. Anything you found here is inadmissible. You know that, Deputy. Eli's jaw tightened. Then, I will find another way. Hollis raised the revolver, aiming it at Eli's chest. I do not think so. You have been a problem for me, Turner. Too honest, too stubborn. And Miss Sinclair, well, she should have taken my offer when she had the chance. Grace stepped forward, her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her throat. You killed Samuel Garrett. You framed me. You sabotaged the mercantile. All to steal my family's land. Hollis's smile widened. I did not kill Garrett. I paid someone else to do it. A drifter, long gone by now. Convenient, really. He owed me money, and I owed him a favor. He took care of a problem, and I took care of yours. Eli's hand twitched toward his gun. You are confessing. Hollis laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. Who will believe you? An overzealous deputy and a known murderer breaking into my office. No, Deputy. You have lost. A voice from the doorway cut through the tension. I believe them. Sheriff Dawson stepped into the room, his own gun drawn, aimed at Hollis. Behind him, Mrs. Fletcher and two other townspeople crowded in the doorway, their faces grim. Hollis's smile vanished. What is this? Dawson moved closer, his gun steady. Deputy Turner came to me 2 hours ago. Told me his suspicions. I did not want to believe it. But then Mrs. Fletcher came forward. Said she heard you bragging at the saloon last month about how you had Cedar Ridge in your pocket. how you could make anyone disappear if they crossed you. I started asking questions. Turns out, a lot of people have seen things they were too afraid to report. Hollis's face twisted with fury. You have no proof. Dawson nodded toward the box on the desk. We have the knife. We have your confession, witnessed by 4 people. And we have Miss Sinclair, who is innocent. Lower your weapon, Hollis. It is over. For a long moment, Hollis did not move. Then, slowly, he lowered the revolver and set it on the desk. Dawson stepped forward, took the weapon, and gestured to one of the townspeople. Get the restraints. As Hollis was led away, Grace sagged against the desk, her legs weak. Eli was at her side in an instant, his hand on her arm, steadying her. You are all right. It is over. Grace looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. You set this up. You planned it. Eli's smile was tired, but real. I told you I would not fail you again. Grace laughed, a breathless broken sound, and then she was in his arms, her face pressed against his chest, his coat rough under her cheek. Eli held her tightly, one hand in her hair, the other wrapped around her back, and for the first time in 6 years, Grace felt safe. The next 3 days passed in a blur. Hollis was formally charged with conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and sabotage. The knife was examined and matched to the wound that killed Samuel Garrett. Witnesses came forward, people who had been too afraid of Hollis to speak before, but who now saw a chance for justice. Grace's name was cleared. The anonymous letter was exposed as a fabrication. The town, slow to believe her innocence, was even slower to apologize. But a few people came forward, Mrs. Fletcher among them, and offered quiet words of regret. Grace's family arrived from their homestead at Red Mesa Ranch, her father gray-haired and weary, her younger brother tall and serious. They embraced Grace on the steps of the church, and her father wept into her hair. The bank appointed a new manager. Grace was offered a permanent position, and she accepted. She found a room at a respectable boarding house run by a widow who did not ask questions. She began rebuilding her life, slowly, carefully, one day at a time. And Eli was there. Not every day, not in a way that drew gossip or scandal, but there, helping her move her belongings, walking her home after work, sitting with her family at Sunday dinner, being the steady, quiet presence she had not known she needed until he was there. A week after Hollis's arrest, Eli found Grace at the livery, checking on the horse her father had brought from the ranch. She was brushing its mane when Eli leaned against the stall door, his hat tipped back, his expression unreadable. I owe you an apology. Grace looked up, surprised. For what? For 6 years ago. For not standing up for you when it mattered. For letting the town drive you away. Grace set down the brush and crossed to him. You wrote me a letter. You told me you believed me. That was more than anyone else did. Eli's jaw tightened. It was not enough. Grace reached up and touched his face, her fingers brushing the stubble on his jaw. It was enough to bring me home. Eli's hand came up to cover hers, his eyes searching hers. I want to do better. I want to be the man you deserve. Grace's throat ached. You already are. Eli leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away. But Grace did not move. His lips brushed hers, tentative and careful. And then the kiss deepened, warm and sure and full of everything they had not said. Grace's hands fisted in his coat, pulling him closer, and Eli wrapped his arms around her, lifting her slightly off her feet. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eli rested his forehead against hers. I am not good with words, but I am good at keeping promises. And I promise I will stand by you, no matter what comes. Grace smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. That is all I need. The weeks that followed were not easy. The town's suspicion did not vanish overnight. Grace still saw the stares, still heard the whispers. But she also saw change. Mrs. Fletcher invited her to tea. The preacher's wife apologized publicly. Mr. Calhoun hired her to do his books, and Eli walked beside her through it all. His presence, a shield, and a promise. In early October, the first snow began to fall. Grace stood on the porch of her boarding house, watching the flakes drift down, and felt a strange lightness in her chest. The past 6 years had been heavy, suffocating, a weight she carried every moment. But now, for the first time, she felt free. Eli appeared at the end of the street, his coat dusted with snow, his breath misting in the cold air. He climbed the steps and stopped in front of her, his eyes serious. I have something to ask you. Grace's heart skipped. All right. Eli pulled off his hat, ran a hand through his hair, and took a breath. I know it has not been long. I know the town still talks. But I also know what I want. And what I want is you. A life with you. A future with you. He pulled a small box from his coat pocket and opened it. Inside was a simple gold band, worn smooth, clearly old. This was my mother's. It is not much, but it is honest. Like I want to be with you. Grace's vision blurred with tears. Eli Turner, are you asking me to marry you? Eli's smile was crooked, vulnerable. I am. If you will have me. Grace laughed, a bright, joyful sound, and threw her arms around his neck. Yes. Yes, I will have you. Eli lifted her off her feet, spinning her once, snow swirling around them. Then he set her down gently and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They were married in the spring, in the little church on the hill, with Grace's family and a small gathering of townspeople who had finally chosen to see the truth. The preachers spoke of forgiveness and second chances, and the grace that covered all mistakes. Grace wore a simple dress, cream-colored with lace at the collar, and carried wildflowers her brother had picked that morning. Eli wore his best suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his face shaved smooth, and when he looked at her, Grace saw everything she had ever wanted, reflected in his eyes. The vows were traditional, spoken clearly and without hesitation. Eli's voice was steady, Grace's was strong. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Eli kissed her with a tenderness that made Grace's heart ache. Afterward, there was a small gathering at the ranch. Grace's father had slaughtered a pig, and the women had cooked for days. There was music and dancing and laughter, and for the first time in 6 years, Grace felt like she belonged. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, Eli took Grace's hand and led her away from the house, toward the creek that ran through the ranch. The water was high with snowmelt, rushing and cold, reflecting the orange and pink of the sky. Eli stopped at the edge of the water and pulled Grace into his arms. Happy. Grace rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Yes. More than I thought possible. Eli kissed the top of her head. I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way. Grace looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You already have. They stood together as the light faded and the stars came out. Two people who had been broken and lost and found again. The past would always be part of them, but it no longer defined them. They were free. They were together. And they were home. The months that followed were the happiest of Grace's life. She and Eli moved into a small house on the edge of town, a place with a garden and a porch and enough room to grow. Grace continued her work as a bookkeeper, building a reputation for honesty and skill. Eli was promoted to sheriff when Dawson retired, and he ran the office with the same quiet integrity that had drawn Grace to him. They attended church on Sundays, had dinner with Grace's family once a month, and slowly, carefully, built a life together. It was not always easy. There were still people in town who looked at Grace with suspicion, still whispers that followed her down the street. But Eli stood beside her, his presence a constant reminder that she was not alone. In the fall, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She told Eli on a cool evening, sitting together on the porch, watching the sun set over the prairie. Eli's face went through a dozen emotions in the space of a heartbeat: shock and joy and fear and love. And then he pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. Their daughter was born in the spring, a tiny squalling thing with dark hair and her father's eyes. They named her Hope because that was what she represented. A future. A new beginning. A life built on trust and love, and the hard-won knowledge that the past did not have to define the future. Grace held her daughter in the rocking chair by the window, sunlight streaming across the floor, and felt a peace she had never known. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, watching them both, his face soft with wonder. She is perfect. Grace smiled. She is ours. Eli crossed to them, knelt beside the chair, and touched his daughter's tiny hand. She gripped his finger, and Eli's eyes filled with tears. I will protect you both. I swear it. Grace reached out and touched his face. I know. Years passed. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who loved horses and books and the stories her mother told about second chances and the people who believed. Eli taught her to ride, and Grace taught her to read. And together they gave her the kind of childhood neither of them had known. Cedar Ridge grew too. The railroad came through, bringing prosperity and change. New families arrived, and the old suspicions faded, replaced by the simple rhythm of life in a frontier town. Grace's bookkeeping business expanded, and Eli's reputation as a fair and honest sheriff spread through the territory. They never spoke much about the past. It was there, a scar that had healed but not disappeared, a reminder of what they had survived. But it did not define them. They defined themselves through the choices they made, the life they built, the love they shared. On their 10th anniversary, Eli took Grace back to the creek at Red Mesa Ranch. It was summer, the water low and lazy, the sky wide and blue. They sat on the bank, their feet in the water, watching Hope chase butterflies through the tall grass. Do you ever regret it? Coming back? Grace looked at him, surprised. Never. Why would you ask that? Eli shrugged, his eyes on their daughter. It cost you so much. The scandal, the fear. I just want to make sure it was worth it. Grace took his hand, lacing their fingers together. It was worth it. All of it. Because it brought me here. To you. To this life. I would do it all again if I had to. Eli brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles, and smiled. So would I. They sat together in the sunlight, watching their daughter play, and Grace felt the weight of the past finally lift. She had been accused, judged, driven away, and hunted. But she had also been defended, believed, loved, and safe. And in the end, she had found her way home. More years. Hope grew into a young woman, strong and independent, with her mother's determination and her father's sense of justice. She went east to study, then returned to Cedar Ridge to teach at the new school. She married a rancher from the next county, a good man who loved her fiercely, and started a family of her own. Grace and Eli grew older together. Their hair turned gray, their faces lined with the years, but their hands still found each other in the dark, and their hearts still beat in rhythm. They sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set, telling stories about the past and dreaming about the future. The town held a celebration for Eli's 20th year as sheriff. There were speeches and toasts, and a plaque that hung in the sheriff's office. Grace stood beside him, her hand in his, and listened as people talked about his integrity, his fairness, his dedication. But when the speeches were done and the crowd dispersed, Eli pulled Grace aside and spoke quietly. None of it would have mattered without you. You are the reason I became the man they are celebrating. You are the reason I learned what it means to fight for something that matters. Grace's eyes filled with tears. And you are the reason I learned what it means to be loved. Eli kissed her, slow and tender, and Grace felt the weight of the years, the struggles and the triumphs, the pain and the joy, all folding into this one perfect moment. They had survived. They had thrived. And they had done it together. On a crisp October morning, 30 years after Grace had stepped off the stage into the dust of Cedar Ridge, she and Eli rode out to Red Mesa Ranch. The old homestead was still there, though her father was long gone and her brother had moved to California. The land belonged to Hope now, and she managed it well, but Grace still loved to visit. They rode slowly, their horses side by side, through the tall grass and the rolling hills. The air smelled of sage and earth and the coming winter. The sky was impossibly blue, endless and clear. Eli reined in his horse at the top of a rise and looked out over the prairie. Grace stopped beside him, following his gaze. Below them, the creek wound through the valley. The ranch buildings nestled in the cottonwoods, smoke rising from the chimney. This is where it all started. Eli's voice was quiet, reflective. Your family's fight for this land. Hollis's greed. Everything that brought you back. Everything that brought you back. Grace nodded. And everything that brought us together. Eli looked at her, his eyes still bright despite the years. Do you think it was fate? Or just luck? Grace smiled. I think it was choice. You chose to believe me. I chose to stay. We chose each other, over and over, even when it was hard. Eli reached across the space between their horses and took her hand. Best choice I ever made. Grace squeezed his hand, her heart full. Mine too. They sat together on the hilltop, two old riders watching the wind move through the grass, and Grace thought about the girl she had been, desperate and afraid, accused of a crime she did not commit. That girl had been broken by the weight of injustice and shame, but she had also been strong enough to survive, strong enough to return, strong enough to fight. And now, 30 years later, she was whole. The past had tried to destroy her, but it had only made her stronger. It had brought her to Eli, to hope, to this life built on trust and love, and the knowledge that second chances were real. Grace lifted her face to the sun, felt the warmth on her skin, and breathed in the scent of home. Beside her, Eli did the same, his hand still holding hers, his presence still steady and sure. They had survived the accusations, the sabotage, the corruption, the lies. They had faced down a murderer and reclaimed their names. They had built a life from the ashes of scandal and fear, and they had done it together. As the sun climbed higher, Grace and Eli turned their horses and rode back down the hill, toward the ranch, toward home. The wind carried the scent of autumn and the promise of winter, but Grace was not afraid. She had weathered worse storms. She had faced darker nights, and she had emerged into the light, hand in hand with the man who had believed her when no one else would. The man who had defended her, protected her, loved her. The man who had become her home. They reached the ranch as Hope and her family were unloading supplies from a wagon. Hope looked up, saw her parents, and waved. Grace and Eli waved back, then dismounted and joined their daughter. Hope hugged them both, her children clinging to her skirts, and Grace felt the warmth of family, the strength of roots, the peace of belonging. This was what she had fought for. This was what mattered. Later, as the family gathered around the table for dinner, Grace looked at the faces she loved. Eli, still handsome despite the years, his eyes crinkling with laughter. Hope, confident and strong, so much like her mother, but with none of the scars. The grandchildren, bright and curious, full of questions and dreams. Grace bowed her head and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. For second chances, for justice, for love, for the man who had stood beside her when the world wanted her to fall. And when she lifted her head, Eli was watching her, his expression tender, and she knew he understood. They had traveled a long, hard road, but they had arrived. Together.